KPBS On Demand is supported by UC San Diego's Art Power, presenting cellist Joshua Roman, performing from his album Immunity, alongside music by J.S. Bach and more. Sunday, June 22nd at UC San Diego's Epstein Family Amphitheater. Reserve your tickets at artpower.ucsd.edu.
Highways were for so long seen as like inevitable features of the urban landscape. They just are. There's nothing else to be done about them. I have been really heartened by the response to my book of people who hadn't thought about this before, or maybe noticed a negative impact of a highway near them. It's no longer just a kind of planning discussion. It's much more kind of a popular movement, I think.
From KPBS in San Diego, this is Freeway Exit. I'm Andrew Bowen. This episode, we're talking with Megan Kimble, author of the new book, City Limits: Infrastructure, Inequality, and the Future of America's Highways. Kimble lives in Austin, Texas, where a grassroots movement has emerged to stop the widening of Interstate 35 through the city's core. Similar movements have sprung up across Texas, a modern wave of freeway revolts. And like the revolts of the 50s, 60s, and 70s, they're protesting the pollution, displacement, and division that freeways are inflicting on communities. But the movements are also taking on new urgency in the face of climate catastrophe. I absolutely tore through this book. It covers a lot of the same history and themes as this podcast. So without further ado, here is my conversation with Megan Kimble. So there are three main settings in your book: Austin, Dallas, and Houston, and each city has its own issues around freeway expansions, freeway removal. I'd like to start in Houston with a woman that you profile named Modesty Cooper. So tell us about who Modesty is and what she's dealing with.
Yeah, so Modesty Cooper is a Black woman in her 30s who lives in Houston's 5th Ward. She grew up in Houston, and she went to work as a civilian for the U.S. military. So she served in Afghanistan and Iraq, a lot of places where the military had missions. And while she was abroad, she decided that she wanted to put down roots back in Houston, where she grew up. And so she started looking for land. She was really interested in development and decided to kind of be the contractor on her own house. So she bought a parcel of land in Houston's 5th Ward and sort of set about building a house from the ground up. She designed it. And, up it went. And she was home in Houston visiting in 2019, and she hadn't yet moved back. She was still working abroad, and she got a letter in the mail from the Texas Department of Transportation saying, hey, we need your land to expand a highway. So her house sits right on the I-10 frontage road, which was a highway that was built right through the middle of the 5th Ward in the 60s. And as part of the North Houston Highway Improvement Project, TxDOT intended to expand this highway and needed, the land that Modesty's home sat on. And so she, her first reaction was, no, thank you. I'd like to keep my house. But she went in to meet with representatives from TxDOT and learned about something called eminent domain, which says that the government can take private property for public use. Owners just have to be justly compensated. So she basically decided to stay home. She didn't go back to Iraq where her job was. She decided to stay in Houston to try to fight this highway expansion.
And she's filed a civil rights complaint, right? Trying to stop this project from actually getting built. Tell me about that.
Yeah, so in early 2021, she filed a civil rights complaint saying that the project would predominantly impact Black and Hispanic people. And indeed, TxDOT's own environmental analysis for the project in the draft environmental impact statement says the effects of the project would be predominantly borne by low-income and minority populations. Modesty saw that and saw, other people like herself who were impacted by this project and filed a complaint. Unbeknownst to her, other people had filed civil rights complaints. So a congressional representative from Houston and a couple nonprofit groups in the city filed similar complaints saying, this project potentially violates Title VI of the Civil Rights Act. The federal government, under Biden, got those letters and intervened to stop the project. So they sent a letter to TxDOT and said, hey, TxDOT, you need to pause all activities on this highway expansion while we investigate these serious civil rights concerns. And that was, I think, really unprecedented. It sent a shockwave across Houston, across the country, got national attention. The fact that the FHWA had intervened to stop such a major project so far into its development.
It's kind of funny because so many of the things that you're writing about in this book happened just like 1 or 2 years ago. So I don't know how fast the news is changing on this, but where does that complaint stand today? And where is Modesty still living in her home?
Yeah, it's so funny talking about the book because I'm like, spoiler alerts, but they're also like massive highway projects that move very slowly. What ended up happening is that project was paused for 2 years. And then actually right as I was finishing my book manuscript, FHWA and TxDOT came to what's called a voluntary resolution agreement. So FHWA told TxDOT it could proceed with this project so long as it like agreed to certain provisions outlined in this agreement. One of them was like extra relocation assistance for people like Modesty, more flood control measures, more money for affordable housing, fractional amount more for affordable housing. But basically what's happening is Modesty is still in her home, but she will lose it. Like that highway expansion is going forward. The authority of eminent domain is absolute. Like roads are sold as a public good. And so an agency like TxDOT has almost kind of unilateral authority to move forward. And what I learned during the reporting my book is like, even the federal government doesn't have very much power, doesn't have very much regulatory oversight over TxDOT.
At one point in this saga, as you're chronicling in the book, Modesty starts receiving postcards in the mail that were kind of creepy. And come to find out, they were sent by a private company that was hired by the Texas Department of Transportation, TxDOT, to do what exactly? And can you describe what these postcards looked like, what they said?
The short answer is Modesty got these postcards. They're extremely weird. I have no idea what the person who sent them was thinking. But on them they say, I want to be your advocate. I want to help you move. I salute you for your environmental justice concerns. But I'm here to be your advocate in helping you move out of your home. So they were sent by a relocation agency, and that's very common for DOTs to hire relocation agencies to help people who are impacted. But their job, the agency, is to get people out of their homes. Their job is not actually to provide justice for homeowners. And so Modesty never felt like she got a fair price for her house. Even now, the offers that TxDOT has given her, she thinks are insulting. In Houston, as in every city in the U.S., real estate prices have risen over the last 5 years, and the last appraisal Modesty got was in 2019. So the purchase price she's been offered for her home is based on a 2019 appraisal. She feels like she's owed much more if she wants to be able to stay in her neighborhood, stay in a similar kind of home. She can't do that with the price she's been offered by TxDOT. But yeah, the postcards really creeped her out. And I think I spoke to people besides Modesty who frankly had been kind of bullied by this relocation agency. There were people who lived in public housing really close to where Modesty lives. There's 2 public housing complexes that will be demolished, Clayton Homes and Kelly Village. And what TxDOT offered them was a Section 8 voucher in replacement of their public housing unit. And Section 8 allows people to go into the private housing market and get basically a subsidy from the government to help pay their rent. And they're very hard to get in every city in America. They're just there's huge waiting lists. But this relocation agency told people hey, if you speak out against the expansion, you won't get your Section 8 voucher. So I talked to actually several residents of public housing who wouldn't go on the record with me because they were terrified of losing access to their voucher, which it's worth saying is illegal. You cannot tell someone that they cannot execute the First Amendment right to speak up against a massive public works project and lose access to housing. But I think their job again is to get people out quickly.
Yeah, and really says a lot about the tools and the methods that the State Department, through its private contractors, are willing to go through to push through these highway expansions, right?
Yeah, absolutely. And another thing that TxDOT does, and it was funny because I saw this, it was peculiar because I saw this in the historical record too, is they basically make this argument to local officials, to communities, hey, if you don't want this highway expansion, we're going to just take our transportation money and go elsewhere. Hey, Houston, we're going to take our $9 billion that we have promised to invest in this region, and we're just going to spend it elsewhere. And TxDOT engineers, they were then called the Texas Highway Department, were doing that in the 50s and 60s. I found, in the newspaper archive, the engineer in Austin told Austin City Council, hey, if you don't want this highway running right through the middle of your city, say so, and we'll take our money elsewhere. And, local leaders understandably are kind of between a rock and a hard place. They might not want a highway expansion, but they also want transportation dollars invested in their communities. They want safer roads, and a lot of these highway expansions promise to make safety improvements. In Houston, particularly, flooding is a huge concern. And so this project would increase kind of like flood mitigation measures along the highway. Those are hugely important. People do not want to lose out on that. But in order to get access to that, they also have to accept a highway expansion.
Texas, of course, is a very conservative state, and traditionally conservative means small government. But at the same time, these are cases of the government seizing private property by force and then spending billions of taxpayer dollars on a public works project. So how do the Republican politicians that govern Texas reconcile this traditional value of small government conservatism and private property rights with the kind of big government actions that it actually takes to widen a freeway?
I think there's this popular belief that roads do not represent government spending, that roads just sort of spontaneously emerge from the earth and that they facilitate free market capitalism. I've heard as much said in government hearings in the state of Texas, that like roads support capitalism and public transit is for socialists. There is this belief that somehow the public money we're spending on roads isn't really public money. It's like comes from our gas tax. So it's like a user supported system, which, if you spend 10 minutes investigating it, you find out that's not true, that, revenue from the general fund has gone to support the Highway Trust Fund for, more than a decade now. Also in Texas, there's this narrative that like enabling seamless car travel helps support economic prosperity. Like Governor Abbott said at one point, like everything we're doing for transportation infrastructure helps keep Texas #1 in the nation for economic development. So like, even though it's a massive government spending, like there is some belief that it will support economic development and prosperity, that like allowing people to get around seamlessly in their cars helps create prosperity. And that is a belief that dates to the origins of the Interstate Highway Program. Like that's not new and that is not exclusive to Republicans. But I think that is like a pretty persistent belief that kind of like justifies this massive government outlay on roads across the country. I will say though, like I talked to this guy in Houston. His name is Mattress Mac. Everyone in Houston knows him as Mattress Mac. He owns a furniture store. He like famously gives away mattresses when the Houston Astros win the World Series. And I went to talk to him. He's a Republican. He's a Tea Party guy. And he told me like this highway expansion is a big government boondoggle. Like this is not how we should be spending public money. It's not going to fix the problem. The neighborhoods around here don't need this.
So let's talk about Austin. TxDOT wants to expand Interstate 35, which is the freeway that runs through downtown. And there has emerged this grassroots campaign to stop the widening. It's called Rethink 35. So tell me about how this organization got started and how they're trying to fight this big freeway widening.
Yeah, so I live a mile from I-35. I'm talking to you from my house, right? I can hear it when I go outside. And I got into this in 2020 when TxDOT allocated nearly $5 billion to widen this highway. TxDOT has been promising to fix I-35 for several decades, starting in the early 2000s. And as a response, a group formed called Reconnect Austin, and their countervision to TxDOT's proposal was to kind of bury the highway and build a lid over it for about 8 miles through the center city, reclaiming a lot of the land that's currently taken up by frontage roads. So that's been around for a long time. TxDOT is aware of it. But kind of along comes this guy, Adam Greenfield, who, got to know the folks behind Reconnect Austin. He moved to Austin from San Francisco and, was very aware of the Embarcadero removal there and was familiar with the narrative of people in San Francisco that before that highway came down, people thought that there would be like cataclysmic traffic congestion. And they were proven wrong. Like that did not ensue. And so he moves to Austin with his wife and kind of is sitting in these Reconnect Austin meetings and thinks like, why isn't there a campaign for full removal? Like, dozens of cities across the country had such campaigns. A handful of cities have actually removed urban highways from their cores. And so he kind of is like, well, we could do that here. He's a bit of an idealist. Why not? Why not make that campaign and kind of shift the window of like what might be possible in a place like Austin? I first met him in early 2021. We met on this hill overlooking I-35, and he painted this very compelling vision of what that land could be used for, what Austin might be like without a massive interstate running through the center of the city. Because there's this real moral clarity around that vision as it relates to climate change. Transportation is the leading contributor to greenhouse gas emissions nationally. On-road emissions in Texas account for 0.5% of total worldwide carbon dioxide emissions. So driving here in Texas, our highways in Texas account for 0.5% of total emissions of all the countries, of all the world, of all the industries. And like that to me is like an absolutely staggering statistic. And Adam really took that and ran with it to kind of say, hey, the city of Austin has all of these climate goals. We have all of these goals to reduce greenhouse gas emissions and air pollution, and widening this highway from 12 to 20 lanes through the center of our city does not get us any closer to those goals. And so, I think he was very much inspired by this grassroots group in Houston called StopText.I-45, who really went door to door in the footprint of the highway expansion and started kind of getting normal people fired up about a pretty wonky, slow-moving thing. And so he formed this group, Rethink 35, that has since really grown to be a kind of pretty formidable grassroots group here in Austin.
We're going to take a quick break. Coming up, we head to Dallas to look at a wildly successful park built over a freeway and why that success is so hard to replicate. Stay tuned.
KPBS On Demand is supported by UC San Diego's Art Power, presenting cellist Joshua Roman, performing from his album Immunity, alongside music by J.S. Bach and more, Sunday, June 22nd at UC San Diego's Epstein Family Amphitheater. Reserve your tickets at artpower.ucsd.edu.
We're back, and here's more of my interview with Megan Kimble, author of the new book, City Limits. One of the reasons that I started this podcast was I was also hearing these conversations around decommissioning freeways, just tearing them down and starting from scratch. And they've been really happening on the fringe of civic discourse, I think. And I feel like this should be a mainstream conversation we should be having. These should not necessarily be just brushed aside as radical ideas. And we shouldn't be tricked into thinking that it's just impossible. Like, we need to really rethink how everything in our city has actually been built, and there was a time when it wasn't there, and we can actually make decisions thinking further into the future about how to develop a different transportation system. But at the same time, I'm also really trying to grapple with the legitimate concerns that people have around decommissioning freeways. So yes, it's possible, but it is hard. And people make major life decisions based on the freeway network that exists today, like where to buy a house or what kind of job to accept. So given that changing the system can be very disruptive, how do you or the folks that you talk to for this book, how would you answer to a skeptic who's saying, no, this highway is just too important to me and I actually need it, don't touch it?
Yeah, I certainly heard from people who said exactly that, people whose livelihoods depend on access to a highway to get them to their jobs. So that was really true in Dallas. I profiled a campaign to remove I-345, which is a stretch of highway that bounds the eastern edge of downtown Dallas. And there's been a campaign for about a decade to remove that stretch of highway. But that highway connects South Dallas with North Dallas, and like most American cities, Dallas has been segregated. So a lot of lower income Black people live in South Dallas, and most of the jobs have concentrated in North Dallas. So, I've talked to people who live in South Dallas who said, I need that highway to get to my job. I need it to access my livelihood. Tearing that down is like insult to injury. You've already segregated my community and my neighborhood and taken away opportunity. Like, you can't take away kind of my lifeline to that opportunity. And I certainly hear and respect that. I think the counterpoint is highways continue to siphon away opportunity and investment from low-income neighborhoods. So because North Dallas can just import workers from South Dallas, the city has not invested in jobs and housing and services in South Dallas. Fundamentally, transportation is a housing issue. That's how I got into it. I was covering housing in Austin at the Texas Observer, where I used to work. Changing land use so that cities can build more housing for people to be able to afford to live next to their jobs and schools and grocery stores will make it so that fewer people have to rely on these highways to get where they're going. So I'm absolutely sympathetic to that's a hard transition. We have built most Western cities, most cities in the Sun Belt and the Western US around the automobile. It's going to take time and effort and money to change that. But like, I think the thing that really animates me is in the state of Texas, we're about to spend $65 billion to make the problem worse. Texas Clear Lanes is this program that Governor Abbott began to fix traffic in Texas cities, and it has allocated $65 billion to widen highways in our 5 major cities. California has a similarly massive highway budget. We need to stop spending billions of dollars actively making the problem worse and redirect that money toward housing and transit to allow our cities to develop more compactly and make better connections between neighborhoods so that people do not need to drive to access everything they need.
One of the themes in this book and something that I've covered in my podcast is the concept of freeway lids. So sink the freeway below surface level and build a cap on top of it. And then you open up all of this new real estate that you can use for parks, you can use it for housing, for anything really. And this is sort of being pitched by TxDOT as a way to mitigate the legitimate concerns around widening freeways. Even in Austin, that they're saying, well, this I-35 expansion that goes through downtown, we're going to build sunken below grade so that, we can have a cap on top of it. But there's a catch, isn't there?
Oh, yes, there is a catch.
Tell me what it is.
I mean, the problem with these caps is that cities have to pay for them themselves. So the city of Austin has to pay for that cap going over I-35. I think the current estimate is about $800 million. That is an enormous amount of money for a city to try to raise through bonds or property tax increases. TxDOT is coming through saying, hey, we're going to widen this highway and we'll let you make it better by putting a cap on top of it. It's well, what if we want to use that money for something else? What if we want to invest in our bike infrastructure, getting more sidewalks on city streets? Austin has a huge sidewalk problem. They just end a lot of places. There's so many more kind of mobility things that we could do with that money besides trying to mitigate the harms of a massive freeway expansion. And I will mention, the city of Austin got a more than $100 million grant from the Reconnecting Communities program from the federal government. And it really, irks me that is being sold as something that will reconnect communities when we are actively disconnecting those communities. We are actively spending billions of dollars of tax money to widen the division between East and West Austin. Oh, but hey, we'll put a park on top of it and call it justice. I don't actually buy that narrative.
Yeah, and something that I really struggle with is a freeway lid can be a really great place for one neighborhood or even just one block. But it's not a scalable solution. The disconnection and the devastation that so many freeways across this country have wrought on communities is just so incredibly vast that we'll never be able to afford to cap all of the freeways that have disconnected communities. So, right, how are we reconnecting them by spending billions and billions of dollars on a mega project that is only solving the problem for a tiny, tiny number of people?
Precisely. And I also wonder if it really is solving the problem for that neighborhoods that are adjacent. Freeways pollute, freeways are enormous sources of air pollution. And there's lots of evidence that shows if you live within 100 or 300 feet of a freeway, you have much higher rates of asthma and other respiratory diseases. Why are we encouraging recreation near these freeways? And the other thing is a lot of my reporting for the book was motivated by climate change. And these parks on top of freeways do not address the underlying issue of climate change. And in fact, highway expansion in a city like Austin, it's actively making the problem worse. I just lived through the hottest summer on record in Austin. All of us did. And the idea that we're just going to put a cap on top of this sort of fossil fuel infrastructure and say that it makes it better. Again, I sort of am I don't buy it.
So I was actually in Dallas recently. I was one of those eclipse migrants. And one of the first spots that I went to was Clyde Warren Park, which is a freeway cap over the Woodall-Rogers Freeway, which goes through downtown Dallas. And it was absolutely packed. I saw lots of kids there playing in this water play area. There was a restaurant on top of it. There were public bathrooms. There was a performance stage, a little kiosk with a donut stand. And I was thinking, damn, this park like really puts San Diego's one freeway lid park to shame. We have a freeway lid park in San Diego, and it was, lauded as this great achievement of collaboration between Caltrans and the community that this freeway was built through. And it's mostly just grass. There's some basketball courts. It's just not as highly amenitized as Clyde Warren Park in Dallas. So, given all those caveats that we just made about how freeway lids are not a scalable solution to the division that freeways cause, what is the story of Clyde Warren Park, and how did it become such a success story in terms of, just creating a really beautiful park that people want to spend time in?
Yeah, Clyde Warren Park is amazing. I too have been there and really marveled at this conjuring of public space over what was just kind of polluted air and concrete. It's totally a miracle, and it's very cool to be there. And I think that park has been very effectively activated, that people actually use it. People who live in Dallas use that park. I think it's unique in the sense that it connected two neighborhoods that were really seeking connection, like downtown Dallas and uptown, that two kind of neighborhoods where development was already happening. There was already a lot of real estate speculation and development around that area. And so it just kind of ignited something that was maybe coming anyway. And I think it's true that a park over a freeway is better than no park over a freeway. If we had limitless money, absolutely, we should cap all our freeways. I don't want to be too Debbie Downer about freeway caps. But again, we don't have limitless money, and a lot of these departments of transportation are selling highway expansions by promising freeway caps. And you can see that even in Dallas. There are two projects on the eastern edge of downtown that are highway widenings, and TxDOT is selling those widenings to Dallas by saying, hey, we'll let you pay to put a park over these highways. Look at Clyde Warren Park. Look how great that was. The kind of answer to that, which this urban planner, Patrick Kennedy, who is kind of the architect of the vision of removing I-345, he always says, yeah, but wouldn't it be better if there was just no highway there to begin with?
So let's talk more about I-345 in Dallas. This is an elevated highway that goes through sort of to the east of Dallas, and it separates downtown from a neighborhood called Deep Ellum. That was also a place I spent a lot of time with when I was visiting. It's a very, busy nightlife district, lots of bars and restaurants. And I-345 is sort of the dividing line. So talk to me about these neighborhoods that surround the freeway and what the vision is for that space.
Yeah, Deep Ellum was this really vibrant business district in Dallas. It was the Black business district, in the 50s and 60s, but it was also integrated. A lot of Jewish businesses and people settled there. And so it was this very vibrant, packed, interracial neighborhood. And the highway came through and just demolished all of those businesses. People moved out. And so today I think it's come back a little bit. There's nightlife and restaurants and bars. But it's certainly nothing like it once was. But largely, I-345 is surrounded by surface parking and public storage, right adjacent to that highway. I'm sure you saw when you're there. I spent a lot of time walking around and under it. It scrambles the street grid, so it's kind of hard to understand how the actual street grid connects under it. It's very easy to get lost. And there's just a lot of wasted space. It's literally asphalt parking lots and dirt lots and construction staging areas. And so the vision is this guy, I mentioned earlier, Patrick Kennedy, moved to Dallas. He was an urban planner. He is an urban planner. And he lived in Deep Ellum and was walking downtown every day to work, and he would walk under that highway every day. And one day he kind of thought well, couldn't this be something better? Why is this thing still here, polluting the air and depressing the land all around it? And so he and a friend started this campaign to remove I-345. And what I think they did really effectively was make the economic argument for removing that highway. It's not just about racial justice. It's not just about climate. It's about all of the land that is depressed by that highway's presence that could be used for something else, something taxable, something to add to the property tax rolls of a city like Dallas that is not growing and desperately needs city revenue. So they calculated that highway impacts, either through its direct footprint or the land that surrounds it, about 250 acres of land, which represents, millions of dollars in property tax revenue and a lot of developable land that you could build affordable housing on, you could build parks, you could do kind of lots of things with that land and start to bring people back who are like, potentially businesses that were displaced by that highway construction. I mean, that gets into a different conversation about kind of like reparative justice. But you could just also do things that like bring people back to the heart of Dallas, because that is a place where people have just absolutely dispersed to the suburbs. And the core does not have that same kind of like significance it once had.
Yeah, I was really struck by how vibrant the street life and the street activity was in Deep Ellum. And then the closer you got to the freeway, the more things just kind of die. And I actually went under the freeway and there was a public art exhibition there that was really cool. It was these images of old advertisements for businesses that were part of Deep Ellum that I guess had been demolished in order to construct the freeway or had somehow just disappeared over the years. And I mean, I'm a freeway nerd, I have a podcast about freeway. So I was like taking all these pictures and really soaking it in. And yet, here I was thinking there's this amazing public art project and nobody was there to see it, because who in their right mind would actually spend time and dwell in a space that is so incredibly noisy and unpleasant to be in? It just struck me as this really incredible dichotomy, almost a missed opportunity for this, art project.
Well, yeah, I don't know if it's a missed opportunity. I just think it's this misunderstanding of like, oh, we can activate these spaces under freeways. Like for a while in Dallas, there was like a proposal to build a soccer field under the highway. That's been true in New Orleans. The Claiborne Expressway is this highway that a planner there has been agitating to tear down for, well over a decade. And there are all these like counter proposals of like, we'll create a food court under the highway, or like a container. I think the latest one was like a shipping container food court / retail space. And they have all failed because like no one wants to spend time under a highway. They're really loud and they're very polluting. I don't know that it's possible to activate that space in a way that's appealing that people actually want to go to.
I think a big theme that applies to both Caltrans and TxDOT is that these are departments that are dominated by engineers. Is this engineering perspective something that you come across a lot in your reporting on TxDOT?
Yeah, absolutely. I think engineers dominate state DOTs across the country. And I think it's instructive, like Caltrans and TxDOT operate in very different political environments, and yet you still see some of the same outcomes, which are highway widenings. And I think that really speaks to the fact that like engineers are doing what they have been trained to do, which is like they're given a problem. You have X number of vehicles on the road. How do you make those vehicles move faster and more efficiently? Credit to the engineers, they're good at figuring out that kind of problem. But I think we've like abdicated kind of a policy question to engineers, right? Like the policy question is like, how do we want people to be moving? Like, how do we want our city to develop? Do we want people to have to get on the highway to get where they're going? Or do we want them to live closer and take transit? And like, those are fundamentally questions that elected officials should be grappling with. And yet I think like what you see is that, particularly in a place like Austin, but I'm sure it's true in lots of California cities, the city council has all of these policy ideas for the city of Austin, and TxDOT comes in and says, no, actually, here's what we're going to do with this highway. Even if they go, even if what TxDOT wants to do is like counter to the policy goals of the city of Austin. And like, I think that just kind of speaks to like how the whole thing is set up, right? Like state DOTs, like their models are set up to measure cars and car travel and how fast are the cars going. And so the projects they deliver are designed to make the cars go faster. And like, there's a whole different way to think about how cities function and how people access goods and services and how do we build economic prosperity. That doesn't necessarily require cars moving fast, but like state DOTs are just like set up to measure that. Like a good example is I saw that in Dallas with the I-345 removal. So TxDOT actually made removal a formal project alternative under their NEPA process as they were going through the like environmental review. They had 5 project alternatives that they presented to the public, and one of them was removal. And so as part of that, they kind of like list, here are the impacts, pros and cons of each one of these options. And for removal, it was like removing I-345 will create something like 19,000 hours of traffic delay, which I feel like it misunderstands the question. It's like, certainly removing a highway will perhaps create more traffic delay, but like, what's the benefit? Maybe the benefit is like millions of dollars of revenue for the city of Dallas. Maybe the benefit is 25,000 housing units. The only pro and con they can measure is like traffic delay and travel delay. And like, there's no way they just like can't compute. There's just no way in the structure of how they analyze projects to say, okay, but these benefits could be like other forms of urban development, other ways of building prosperity that just like doesn't factor into the traffic modeling. And like, it could, like, I have talked to people who say DOTs could incorporate this, but like an agency like TxDOT is like, okay, so we look at the projected population growth of Dallas. We're going to assume everyone is moving here with a car. Therefore, we have to build infrastructure that accommodates X number of cars. You could say all of these people are moving to Dallas. We don't want them to have to move with a car. What kind of infrastructure could we build so that they don't need a car? But that again gets into policy, and engineers are not the appropriate policymakers, and yet we've sort of abdicated their responsibility to them.
And another thing that I think engineers, departments of transportation fail to engage with, a question that they fail to engage with is, okay, let's say you remove a highway. How does that factor into everybody's calculus about when they're going to drive, where they're going to drive, and whether they're going to drive at all? I mean, traffic evaporation is a real phenomenon that we have observed in many cases of freeways being removed. And, it basically just means, well, the road isn't there anymore, so maybe I'll go somewhere closer, or maybe I'll take a different route to get wherever I'm going. Or maybe a trip just won't happen at all. So I'll stay home and sit with my kids instead of going to the grocery store, or I'll link two trips together. I mean, these decisions, these microeconomic decisions that people make about how and when to drive places are very complex, and it doesn't seem like our departments of transportation have really figured that out or managed to incorporate that into their planning.
Oh, completely. Like, people are rational consumers of goods, and travel is a good. People will consume that rationally. So like the 19,000 hours assumes that people are just going to mindlessly take the same route to work they have always taken, instead of pulling up their Google Maps and like being like, how could I get there differently? Like, Dallas is a city full of highways. Perhaps they take a different highway. So my favorite example of this is in the environmental impact statement for the I-35 expansion in Austin. They have like part of the like purpose and need of the project is like, we have to address future travel congestion. And so TxDOT lays out the travel times on I-35 given population growth and the demand on the road. And so it's like, today, to travel the 8 miles across Austin in rush hour takes something like 35 minutes. Well, if we don't expand this highway by 2050, that same 8-mile trip will take 223 minutes. 223 minutes is 3.5 hours. Like, I can walk 8 miles in 3.5 hours. Can you imagine pulling up your phone, looking at Google Map, and seeing that your like trip downtown to meet your friend for happy hour is going to take 3.5 hours? Like, you would not go. No rational consumer of travel would take that trip. But TxDOT's models cannot incorporate the trip not taken. They cannot incorporate how people are like sort of dynamic consumers of that good. They just assume this like latent demand that will always exist.
Still ahead, Megan and I compare notes on driving the freeways of Southern California and the freeways of Texas. And she shares where these modern freeway revolts are headed as they battle a seemingly unstoppable bureaucracy like TxDOT. Stay with us.
KPBS On Demand is supported by UC San Diego's Art Power, presenting cellist Joshua Roman, performing from his album Immunity, alongside music by J.S. Bach and more, Sunday, June 22nd at UC San Diego's Epstein Family Amphitheater. Reserve your tickets at artpower.ucsd.edu.
We're back, and here is the rest of my conversation with Megan Kimble, author of the new book, City Limits. So you have some California connections, right? You spent part of your life driving on the freeways of Southern California. Do you have any observations about the differences between freeways in California versus Texas, both in the design of the physical structures and also how people behave on them?
Oh, yeah. Oh, I love that question. Yeah, I grew up outside of Los Angeles and lived in Santa Monica after college. So I spent a lot of time grinding on the freeways of LA. And I've spent a lot of time in San Diego, also driving around. I think that LA in particular is like so well branded in the national conscious as this like car-centric city, you know, like no one walks in LA. But I have found actually the freeways in Texas are so much bigger, so much harder to navigate, so much more confusing. They just like take up so much more space. There are so many interchanges here that are the height of skyscrapers. You know, as a pedestrian, you like look up at them. I went to the High Five in Dallas when I started reporting this book, and it's the first like 5-level interchange built in the US. And it is staggering to like be a pedestrian in the street on the sidewalk looking up at like, I think it's something like 300 feet tall. So like, it is true that everything is bigger in Texas. And because we have built these interchanges, the idea is you just like whip around, you know, the Texas U-turn where you like don't even have to stop to make a left turn and a left turn if you want to go back the way you were coming. They have these like U-turns that go around over freeways, and there are slip lanes galore. So I actually think they're incredibly dangerous. And the one way that they're really dangerous is like when they interface with an urban environment. So like our frontage roads here, there's one near my house that people drive 50, 60 miles on the frontage road. And it was designed to encourage that kind of speed. And yet it's right next to like a shopping center. So it's like I go to there's like a Target there. And it's absolutely terrifying because you have to basically stop to turn in to the Target parking lot. And cars are going past you at 60 miles an hour. That is a recipe for crashes. And indeed, like the I-35 frontage road is the most dangerous road in the city. Like 1 of 4 fatalities happen there. And I think that's because of the design.
Your book does a really excellent job of connecting the dots between housing policy and transportation policy. You mentioned that you started covering housing, and that sort of led you down this path of reporting on freeways. And one sentence you write in your book, which really stuck with me, is induced demand was always a housing story. So we have all of these suburban developments that were built basically from scratch. It's a very spread out land use, and that makes any mode of travel other than the automobile almost impossible. Houston is a city that is often held up by people on both sides of the political spectrum as an example of a city that has successfully tackled homelessness and housing affordability. It famously does not have zoning laws, so, limits on density, on, the segregation of land uses, like you can only build housing here or you can only build commercial development here, doesn't apply in this city. But I wonder that in the way that Houston has grown in this really sprawling manner, is the story a bit more complicated than just housing is cheap here and we managed to solve homelessness by building a lot of housing?
Oh, I love that question and love that you pulled out that line. Yeah, it's absolutely more complicated. There was a study that came out before I started reporting my book that kind of helped me conceive of this, which is when you add housing and transportation together, it's just as expensive to live in Houston as it is New York City. Because I think it's something like Houstonians spend about 20% of their disposable income on transportation. In New York City, which is transit dominated, people spend about 7% of their disposable income. So, indeed, your house might be cheaper, but you're spending a lot of money on gas and your car payment and car repair to drive the vast distance back to where you need to be. That cheapness is a little bit artificial. Like when you look at the full cost of what it takes to maintain a household, for example, in Katy, Texas, which is a suburb of Houston, 50 miles from downtown, it's significant. It's there's a huge cost to a household for that. There's also a huge environmental cost. Houston is sinking because it has spread out and paved over so much of its landscape that the Katy Prairie, which is again on the western edge of Houston, has been paved over with housing subdivisions. And so now when there's massive rainfall events, it floods and all that water goes downstream into Houston. And that is in part because of this massive highway that encouraged these suburban subdivisions way out, in this open prairie land. So there's a huge environmental cost to that kind of development. I often see this narrative of like, well, this is like enabling housing choice. Like people want to live in the suburbs. They want to live in these like big houses and have a big lawn and big backyard. But I don't think that's true. Like I talk to a lot of people, particularly in Austin, who would love to live in a central neighborhood where they can walk and bike to get where they need to go, but they simply cannot afford it. And so they have moved to suburbs like Round Rock and Kyle and San Marcos and are commuting back to Austin on the highway. And that in large part is due to the city of Austin's housing policy. So how I got into all of this is I wrote like a pretty long story for the Texas Observer about Austin's effort to update its zoning code, which has not been updated since 1984. And most land in the city of Austin, you can't build anything more dense than a single family house with an ADU on it. And as a result, like as Austin has boomed, all of that growth has happened on the fringes. And people who would love to live in central Austin can't. They simply cannot afford to. So we're pricing out teachers and, nurses and ER workers who then commute back to the city. I wrote that story, and then a few months later, TxDOT allocated $4 billion to expand this highway. And I was like, well, these are the same story, right? These are like, it's not just TxDOT is the big bad wolf and they're coming in to widen a highway that no one wants. They're responding to like something of a demand because our housing policy has pushed people to the fringes. And like, it's definitely incumbent upon cities and states to create better housing policy so that people can afford to live where they need to be.
That makes me think of a quote from a professor who I spoke to for Freeway Exit, who basically said that the creation of the interstate highway system and the development of the suburbs is perhaps the greatest experiment in social engineering that our country has ever undertaken. There is this sort of natural desire or gravitation towards places where other people are, these compact neighborhoods where you can walk and experience your surroundings in a more intimate kind of way when you're not, enclosed in your car. And yet, all of the policy decisions about where housing gets built, about what kind of transportation infrastructure gets built, are forcing us into a different type of lifestyle that maybe a lot of people think they want at the very beginning, but then realize that there are a lot of trade-offs that make it less attractive. I feel like I've read a lot of examples in your book about somebody who, buys a home in the exurbs thinking, this is going to be great. I'm going to have so much space for, the kids to play in and the dogs to run around in the yard and everything. And then the commute starts creeping up on them more and more, and they start enjoying their life less and less.
Yeah, I mean, I talk to so many people who are like super commuters who have to, spend 2 or 3 hours a day in the car and like how that impacts their quality of life. And it's not good. People really actually don't like to commute. But we have also built this system where to build generational wealth, you feel like you need to buy a home in America. And the only place people can afford to do that in many cities is the suburbs. But indeed, I totally agree. Like, this is not the result of like a lot of people choosing this way of living. It is the result of like 70 years of massive government subsidies that have encouraged people to move to the suburbs. And we should say like white people to move to the suburbs. Like the part of the social experiment is a racial one, that the origins of a lot of this zoning policy and highway creation was to segregate cities by race. The legacy of that is like very active today. Like it's not an accident that this highway expansion in Houston will disproportionately impact Black and Hispanic people. It's because that highway was originally built through Black and Hispanic neighborhoods. And so the people who still live next to it, who still bear all the negative consequences, remain Black and Hispanic neighborhoods. I agree with that quote, that it is this massive social experiment. And like, I think we're beginning to see, or we have been seeing for the past couple of decades, like the enormous costs of that kind of development.
You really get the sense reading your book that this is a David and Goliath story. These scrappy activists are taking on a massive state bureaucracy, and that bureaucracy has a lot of money, a lot of political support, and not a lot of accountability. Do you think these folks have any hope? Is TxDOT just going to go ahead and widen these freeways no matter what? And if that happens, what becomes of these groups, these connections, these movements that have sprung up in opposition to freeway widenings?
I certainly think it's a David and Goliath fight. I mean, TxDOT is supported by the Highway Trust Fund, which is just this like enormous billions and billions of dollars a year, unending flow of federal money to states. So there's like an enormous amount of resources behind state DOTs. I do think the grassroots opposition to this kind of endless highway expansion, it's like pretty new. Stop Textile I-45, this group in Houston, started in 2019. So they're 5 years old. The group in Austin started 3 years ago. So the kind of argument I make in my book is like these modern freeway revolts have not like come into the mainstream. They have not reached saturation. But I think they are growing and they are becoming more powerful as more and more people see the negative impacts of these freeways. And it's increasingly becoming a climate fight. I mentioned in the book this like teenager in Portland who organized a group of high school students to protest outside of the Oregon Department of Transportation to protest a highway widening, and they held signs that say climate leaders don't widen freeways. You're certainly seeing that in California, which has committed to really ambitious climate goals. And I think there is this like, you can't pretend to support the climate and continue to widen highways. Like highways are fossil fuel infrastructure. And I think that is becoming increasingly kind of like well known, but it certainly is not mainstream. And so I think what gives me hope is like these grassroots groups are really new. They're learning how to organize. They're like beginning to talk to each other for the first time. I watched that happen in Texas where like organizers in Austin and Houston started talking to each other. They started talking to organizers in Dallas. They organized protests at the Texas Transportation Commission, the like body that oversees TxDOT. I went to the first gathering of the national gathering of freeway fighters in Cincinnati last fall, which was like grassroots groups from across the country came together to try to talk about like how do we change policy? How do we start to fight these state DOTs? So I kind of see it as like potentially where the pro-housing movement was a decade ago. Like, the YIMBY movement was just kind of isolated groups and communities across the country, and it has become absolutely mainstream today. I mean, it took a housing affordability crisis for that to happen, but I kind of think that like we are in a climate crisis. Congestion is not getting better. The wider, the more highways we build, air pollution is getting worse. So I think what gives me hope is like kind of these grassroots groups will mature and the organizing will get more powerful.
You've been promoting your book for a couple of weeks now. Any observations, anecdotes from the promotional tour, as it were, that you'd like to leave our listeners with? Any conversations that you've had with people that really stick out to you?
Yeah, I mean, not to like toot my own horn, but I have had like full rooms at every event I've done. And that to me tells me that like people are fired up about this. Like I think highways were for so long seen as like inevitable features of the urban landscape. They just are. They just are part of our lives. There's nothing else to be done about them. And I think people are like, I see like an appetite and energy around what is kind of like a wonky planning issue. People are fired up about this. And so I have been really heartened by the response to my book of people who like maybe hadn't thought about this before, or maybe like had noticed a negative impact of a highway near them, that like they're kind of like new people are kind of awakening to this, and that it's no longer just a kind of planning discussion. It's like much more kind of a popular movement, I think.
That was Megan Kimble speaking with me about her new book, City Limits. Freeway Exit is produced by me, Andrew Bowen, and is edited by Brooke Ruth. I know it's been a couple months since our last episode. I've been hard at work covering my beat of local government in San Diego, so thank you for your patience. We'll have more for you in 2024. If you like this podcast, please leave us a rating and review on your favorite podcasting app. Even better, tell your friends about Freeway Exit so we can keep our audience growing. Lastly, KPBS is a nonprofit news organization. And did you know donations from listeners like you make up more than 2/3 of our budget? So if you value this kind of journalism and want to keep it going, please consider becoming a member at kpbs.org/donate. Thanks for listening.
KPBS On Demand is supported by UC San Diego's Art Power, presenting cellist Joshua Roman, performing from his album Immunity, alongside music by J.S. Bach and more, Sunday, June 22nd at UC San Diego's Epstein Family Amphitheater. Reserve your tickets at artpower.ucsd.edu.